First of all, to everyone who's with us, good evening. And we are delighted to be here. We are here at home in Marble Arch, our home, myself and Ilana, my wife and our family. We live here in Marble Arch, and I'm the rabbi of the Western Marble Arch Synagogue, an Orthodox Jewish synagogue here in the West End. And I'm delighted that I'm joined this evening for the first of a series of 3 conversations by Revd Dr Sam Wells. We have we're looking forward to this very much. We've been discussing it for quite some time. A little bit, I'll explain a little bit about me and how I met Sam, and he'll explain a little bit about what he does as well. Sam, Reverend Sam, Dr. Sam Wells is the vicar at St. Martin in the Fields, which is not far. It's a 35-minute walk, which we did yesterday, myself and my son. So we had a lovely time going over there to see him see his area. A few years ago, I was driving my kids to school, and I came across, I dropped them off and I got back in the car, and it was Thought for the Day on Radio 4. And I was listening to Reverend Sam, and in classic sense, I can't remember exactly what he said. All I remember is that I was completely blown away by everything that he was saying at the time. And it was quite a profound message that we really felt was quite extraordinary. And I was so taken at the time that I actually pulled the car over afterwards. I sat on the side of the road. I Googled St. Martin in the Fields. I found an email address, and I sent an email saying, "Hi, you don't know who I am. I'm Daniel Epstein. I've just listened to your Thought for the Day, and it was really quite extraordinary. Can we meet?" So we did. And I think that's how it started. And since then, we've been in conversation on various things. We've met at various times. We exchange material. So if I'm speaking in a synagogue on a Saturday morning, I'll sometimes send my material to Sam, who'll critique it. Sometimes he sends some of his material over to me for a Sunday. So if it sounds like I'm talking from his pulpit and he's talking from mine, it's because we got our notes crossed. But ultimately, it's been a wonderful friendship so far, and we're looking forward to this. Mm-hmm. So great to be here. It is great. It's lovely. So we're going to get started. Just a little housekeeping for us, so that everyone knows what's going on for the next couple of minutes, and then we'll get started. The first thing is that this is a course of 3 conversations. And to explain exactly what they are based on this book that we have been reading, God's Unfailing Word, which I'm sure you will have a chance to see and view. You can actually download it, as we said, from the Church of England's website. If you just Google God's Unfailing Word, it's a 144-page document, quite fascinating. And it is the basis of this book that we'll be having for our conversations. I'm going to share the screen for just a moment to show you one single slide. And that is basically the title page from this book. As you can see, the book has 6 chapters. And tonight we'll be discussing chapters 1 and 2 broadly, a difficult history and a distinctive relationship. We'll explain a little bit about those. The next talk we're doing is in 2 weeks' time on the 20th of June. That's Sunday, 2 weeks. And that'll be chapters 3 and 4, mission and evangelism and teaching and preaching. And then the last discussion on the 4th of July, I thought quite aptly, although that's how it just turned out, is the land of Israel, and what it means to both of us theologically, emotionally in many senses, and ethical discernment and common action. How are we going to behave as a result of the way things are, and how we see our importance and our involvement in the world, both our communities, broadly, politically, and also in terms of civil and civic society. So if you wanted to get into the nitty-gritty of maybe the last few weeks of quite challenging activities, or quite challenging, I would say, even the hostilities in Israel, that's probably something we will address primarily, if we're going to get to it, in the 3rd week. So we're going to try and be as honest as we can and keep to these topics so that we can get through this book and do it the credit that we promised we would. And that's the first thing. The second thing I'd like to say is that we're not going to take questions as such here. And I'd also like to introduce Jonathan Evans, who also works at St. Martin in the Fields, another pastor. Sam can introduce him in a moment, and he'll be sort of moderating a little bit. So what I would ask you to do is, during the course of our conversation, if you place any of your comments or your questions in the chat, Jonathan, towards the end, will pick out a few and ask them for us, which makes it easier. We can focus exactly on what we're doing. And then it'll be easier to do rather than take live questions, which could be difficult for us to fit into the time, if that's okay with you. We're also recording this session, so all of your comments and questions will be saved in the chat function, so that even after we finish recording, we can review some of those. And if there are some relevant points, we can actually pick them up again in 2 weeks' time, so that gives us a chance to continue. So without further ado, I'm really delighted, and I'm going to ask Sam to introduce Jonathan first, and then get started on our discussion this evening, which I'm delighted that we are doing, and really excited to be doing with you, Sam.
Well, thank you, Daniel. Jonathan Evans is one of my colleagues at St. Martin's. His particular responsibility is what we call Heart Edge, which is our ecumenical and international movement for the renewal of the church. And the church, in the kind of spirit of the conversation we're having tonight, what we'd like to think was generous, was receptive, was inclusive, and perhaps doesn't have some of the strident features that might alarm some of your folk and possibly some of mine about how Christianity sometimes is manifested. And that's, Jonathan has built that from dot to now a large movement with well over 1,000 members on 4 continents. And so it's become a big thing in the last 4 years. And so we've put this dialogue into the wider Heart Edge program. And we've had, since March of last year, an awful lot of dialogues on everything, on race and on climate change, and all the issues that come up. But we've had dialogues about. So
fantastic, that's great, wonderful. Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Jonathan, for being with us. And I think we'll get started with our discussion. So, looking through the book, it really is quite an amazing read. It was put together. You want to tell me a little bit about why it was put together? In what sense, what they were trying to achieve?
Really, Christian-Jewish dialogue got a whole new impetus from about the 1930s onwards, the sense that Jews were being persecuted in Germany. Obviously, we know where that went next, into the Holocaust, and then it changed its character and became a matter of Christians facing up to their responsibility, their guilt for what had led to the Holocaust, not always for the Holocaust itself, but there were obviously Christians on all sorts of sides of the Second World War conflict. And so it gathered pace under William Temple from the Christian side, originally in the 1940s, followed by Michael Ramsey in the 1960s as Archbishop. But what there hasn't been has been a definitive Church of England understanding of how Anglicans relate to Jews in general. And that's what this document for the first time is.
Right, so for people watching maybe from our community, the Anglican Church is the Church of England, which is not the Catholic Church, which is a different...
Yeah, so okay, so
we need, I think,
the Church split in the 11th century between the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholic, and the Western Church, what was all the Catholic Church, split in the 16th century, this is CE, between Protestants and Catholics. Anglicans think of themselves as both Catholic and Reformed. So there's a particular strand of Christianity, the retained Catholic order, bishops, priests, and deacons, those kind of things, but largely Protestant doctrine. So not usually reading the apocryphal books and having fairly uncompromising views about things like not tending to believe in purgatory, not tending to believe in a high view of Mary, those kinds of things. So, and of course, through the British Empire, not entirely, but largely, the Anglican Communion was born, which now has about 42 provinces worldwide, and is, I think, the third biggest denomination in Christianity.
Okay, so a little bit of background. Let's get straight into our first chapter. The first chapter of the book is called Difficult History, and the book itself defines this and starts with the sense of exactly how Christianity started. And we're looking at the very, very earliest elements of Christianity, starting from even before the formal Christianity that we know, and I guess with the birth of Jesus, with the ascension of Jesus in, you said, in around the year 33 of the Common Era. And then we have, from a Jewish perspective, the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70 of the Common Era. So we're talking about the first 100 years of the Common Era, of what we would call CE, and that is where there is a sense of what we would call the parting a real parting of the ways. You want to talk
Well, I think what
that?
you've just described there, Daniel, is that Judaism fundamentally changed in what I would call the first century. And rabbinic Judaism, as we know it, was more or less born because of the loss of the temple. And that was a catastrophe, which it arguably took Jews centuries to come to terms with. But out of it came a whole new understanding of Judaism through the texts that were written as commentaries on the scriptures. And Christianity was never intended to be separate from Judaism. You know, that is a tragedy and a disaster. It's one that Christians almost never describe in those terms. It's what I would describe in those terms. And I think the two themes that we're looking at today, both the difficult history and the theology, for me, they coalesce really around one single statement, which is that for me, Judaism is not another religion for Christianity. Judaism is the parent of Christianity. Now, you can have a difficult relationship with your parent, but there is no Christianity without Judaism. Jesus was a Jew. The whole structure of Christianity is Jewish. And what I would call the Old Testament, obviously it has the Tanakh, I guess you would call it, is 3/4 of the Christian Bible. So, and it hasn't stopped being so, it hasn't been superseded. So there is no part of my faith that I can say was simply created from scratch in the first century. It's all a nuance and refinement of Judaism. So the idea that Christianity has somehow replaced Judaism is just completely wrong. And in Ephesians 2, sometimes called Paul's letter to the Ephesians, but sometimes people question whether he wrote it, so I'll call it Ephesians 2, second chapter of Ephesians, the church is described fundamentally as the breaking down of the dividing wall between Jew and Gentile. And that is fundamentally what church is. And for that not to be still Jewish is absurd. It's just meaningless. And to the extent that Christians have lost sight of that is the sense that they've not just lost sight of how to relate to Jews, it's to the extent that they've lost sight of what the church was always supposed to be in the first place.
So that's a very interesting point to get started with. So I'm going to also go back a little bit and try and figure out exactly where we went in those very first early years. The idea of what we would call temple-centric Judaism, where most of our function and most of our faith revolved around sacrifices, about our pilgrimages to Jerusalem, about getting involved in being in Jerusalem. Being there was very much how we defined our relationship with God. And over the course of time, especially from the destruction of the first temple, which either in 432 or 586, depending on how you would describe it precisely, was a point at which there was an exile. And so the Jews themselves had left their place in Jerusalem and in Israel proper at the time, and had been taken out into a way out of in exile, out of Israel itself, and towards Babylon, towards other places. And so there was already a sense of having to maintain a Judaism and a connection to their faith without the sense of a building as such, which would be the focus. But what's interesting is that Judaism, even before that, was formed. The Jewish people, having experienced the revelation at Sinai, had no temple, had no land at the time that they were coming back to it from the lands of the forefathers. And so the whole structure of what Judaism didn't require, in the sense, a land or a temple. That evolves into it. So Judaism already is on a journey, and it evolves into the temple, the Mishkan, the sanctuary, which is described in Exodus 20, or most from there onwards. Exodus 25 and onwards, we have this extraordinary description of how the tabernacle is going to be built. That is the beginnings of this notion of a temple or a sanctuary-centric Judaism. But even before the destruction of the first temple, and definitely before the building of the second and the destruction of the second, there was already a sense that Judaism was starting to exist very much vibrantly outside of this ability. In fact, there's a fantastic piece which I love in Zechariah chapters, I think it's Zechariah 7 and 8, if I remember, when a number of people come from Babylon towards Jerusalem. They ask, if the second temple is being built, do we still have to mourn for the first? Which is a brilliant expression as to we're trapped in this idea of trying to figure out how we're supposed to express ourselves. And Zechariah turns around and says, and he says, well, ask God. And God, and because we have all these fasts which commemorate, which we're about to come up to now, this is quite an appropriate period for discussing this. Fasts that talk about the siege around Jerusalem, the breaching of the walls of Jerusalem, the ultimate destruction of Jerusalem on the 9th of Ab, which is coming up in a few weeks' time. And what God turns around to Zechariah and says, he says that I didn't put these fasts in, you did. So why are you asking me whether you need to or not? Another classic example of God returning the power, as it were, and the determination of how we run our people back to us. So the interesting element is that the temple is a focus for us, but also a sense of our own, the evolution of how we're supposed to see our faith is also something that's almost been bequeathed back to us in partnership with God. So we do move from temple to a rabbinic-centric Judaism, but that for us is a constant evolution that's still going. So I find that as interesting as opposed to, as you said, the split at the point where Jesus and Christianity move in a particular direction. Judaism has constantly been moving and evolving in its own direction. And therefore, the parting of the ways for you, which is interesting, as saying it has its basis in Judaism. For me, the Judaism that I have also doesn't have a supersessionist approach whereby there's something that's lacking that we would need, as it were, assistance to find. And that relationship with God has always been there. And I think that's where the interesting part of that, as we said, a difficult history on the basis of that for Christianity at the time, feeling that somehow the Jews were lacking in some element of what was supposed to be their covenant. And therefore, there are only two options to that. Either we pull you into this covenant under, from your own perspective, or we pull you in under duress. And that duress got, what I would say, I think to understate it, has got extremely out of hand over the course, to put it mildly, into almost a bloodthirsty desire to pull us in every sense into this sense of the new covenant. And I think that really is the difficult history that we start with.
I think it's a very generous reading of the difficult history. I think
I'm just getting started.
There's something. I mean, that's fabulous. That's a wonderful account. Thank you. So if we look at the particular aspects of that difficult history, it clearly takes on a significant dimension from the 4th century onwards, when Constantine becomes emperor, when Christianity and the empire become synonymous, for a relatively short period of time, but nonetheless, that fixes a mindset for Christians, which is then resumed after the Dark Ages, if one so uses that expression, but certainly in the Middle Ages, that becomes, and it's 1290, I think, the Jews are expelled from England, and then subsequently from the other countries in Western Europe. That whole sense that difference was intolerable. Now, obviously, we talk about difference a lot in our contemporary discourse, not usually about this difference, often about things like sexuality and race. But the whole, whether it's part of the pathology of Christianity that it finds difference difficult to deal with. And as I say, I think difference, I don't regard Judaism as another faith, as I've already said. I do regard Islam as another faith, and in a whole other sense, Buddhism and Hinduism and so on. But Judaism is the parent of Christianity, and so there's not only that sense of a sort of superiority complex, which is inappropriate. The Christians somehow feel they set the agenda, they set the calendar in terms of the dates we're talking about are determined by a Christian perspective on dates, but also that they set the norm for what you should believe, and Jews are perceived to deviate from that norm, and therefore they are the ones under scrutiny. And I think that's just wrong in that Christians must always explain to Jews why they need this Christ and why they should imitate or join this church. And they haven't done a very good job of actually making a case for that. And rather than blame themselves for that, they've tended to choose the obstinacy of the Jews of not consenting to what was obviously so. Well, that was obviously so because of power rather than because of truth. And of course, once religion and power get mixed up, you tend to find it difficult to tell the difference between truth and power. And that's been the story of Christendom for the majority of the last 2,000 years, tragically. And it's not just, I mean, it's clearly the Jews who've suffered the most, but actually Christianity has suffered in that. Christianity for a lot of that time has lost its identity because it's had this superiority complex. It's assumed its job was to chair the meeting. It's assumed its job was to get the whole world to conform to itself. In Tom Holland's wonderful book Dominion, there's a description of an Indian from the subcontinent in the 19th century who describes Christians as people who go around the whole world and force people to live like them. It's just so painfully close to the truth that it's almost impossible to read it without grieving. So I mean, so most of the issues I think arise from Christianity's inability to deal with people not conforming to its ways. And then of course, when that comes, well, it appears at times in the Middle Ages, the Albigensian Crusade, for example, in France in the 13th century is an early example of that, but it becomes big time in the Reformation, where different Christian branches find it intolerable for different kinds of Christianity to appear. So it's not just a Jewish thing; it becomes a thing about any kind of difference from the Christian norm. And I do think Christians have to look at themselves and say, is this part of the DNA of Christianity, or can we now show that there is a different way to be, inspired by your Zechariah 7 and 8 narrative, that, or to use an expression I use in Heart Edge a lot, that the future is bigger than the past.
So that's, I'm just trying to unpack all the things that you've said, but I want to pick up on one thing which I really find quite extraordinary. What you said was that Christianity seems to, in its sense, have failed to have made the case for itself theologically or logically, and therefore has used power and suppression and maybe crusade to try and force people into its way of thinking. And if it had a stronger, I want to say, from your perspective, a stronger message, or was better able to articulate its message.
Or better able to live its message, frankly, because the best form of persuasion is example. Once you have to start using words, you've already made a concession. So, and
as a result of that, then, if the church would have done its job correctly, the Jews would have accepted.
Well, and I think accepted isn't quite the right word. To me, that sense of common cause between the church and the Jews would have been, self-evident to both sides. It seems to me. I don't know how to put it. I don't want it to be a territorial thing, where we're getting onto the theological territory. We should probably introduce the different categories.
Yes, I thought we would, but let's just finish this.
I think the assumption has always been, and this is what I mean by the superiority complex, that Christians expect Jews to move onto our territory. Now, I found this when I lived in the American South for a few years. There were lots of white Christians.
Duke University.
Yeah, Duke University. There was a lot of white Christians who longed for the interracialization of the church, but they tended to be people who assumed that black Christians should come to white churches. So there was still this kind of, you've got to come onto our territory. And I think the same rule applies for the way Christians think about Jews. Why don't they come and join us?
Well, that's always the sense. In fact, and we'll have to get into this. Will be, I think, the root of most of our second conversation will be, why is it that there's still this sense that we are, as it were, supposed to come onto your page of thinking?
Whereas you're our parent, you see, that's how I see it.
So why are we needing to come onto your page, and you can't allow us to live our original, as it were, approach to Judaism and our covenant with God,
I think the answer to that,
without being made to feel not just inferior, but be absolutely persecuted throughout the ages for it.
So I think the answer to that, leaving aside the power games and things, which is obviously a big part of the answer, but the answer in the imagination is this theology of deficit that you hinted at before, which is that Christians' knowledge of what we've called rabbinic Judaism, the Judaism that post-dated the destruction of the Second Temple in about 70 CE, is just miserably shallow. And so the assumption has been that Jews are the people that just believe the rather unpalatable part of the Bible, and they don't have the love stuff. They're the ones that, all the prejudices about the first part of the Bible, whatever we call it, or the whole Bible as you would see it, are negative. All the negative stereotypes are visited then upon Jews, God of wrath and all this kind of thing, ritualistic, all of these kind of negative stereotypes. Whereas the assumption, New Testament, usually made by people who haven't read it very closely, is that it's all love, joy, peace, and crumbly candy bars. And that's the part the Christians go for, the wise ones. So obviously you should tack on the bit that we tack on because there's no understanding of the life of Judaism in the last 2,000 years. It's understood entirely in deficit, what you don't have. And it's like your history, the phrase is used in the book, the phrase a fossil. Yes. I thought that really made me stand up and think. But I think that it's a good word because it's the assumption that Christians make that Judaism basically stopped.
Died in the year 70.
Yeah, exactly.
There's nothing else.
Nothing's happened since then. You're just sort of remembering something that happened. And there's no, you had a temple and now you haven't got a temple. So what you got? What are you dealing with? And that obviously is so desperately sad and impoverished, but I'm afraid that is the state of the imagination, the Christian imagination, even at very, scholarly senior levels. You should know a lot better.
So for our perspective, the Talmud itself and the Mishnah, that is the legal codification of how we're supposed to behave in every single aspect of our lives, comes alive as a result of leaving or being away from the country and the temple, and now having to figure out how to live a life which is primarily existing, or at least it does, until a return to the land, which we'll discuss, as we said, in the third. But
that just gets dismissed as ritualistic and legalistic.
But it's all of the things that I feel I enjoy learning of the Talmud and the Mishnah with such rich, not just stories, but an evolution of a legal code, a jurisprudence, a judicial system, a powerful understanding of how to exist in an area that is not yet the promised land, or was once and will be again. And that sense for us is really where I find the strength and the power and the beauty of that evolving Judaism happens between 70 and now. It happens before, and the Old Testament, which is seen or described as the Old Testament, or what we call the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, is this God of wrath and is always presented as a God of difficulty. And we see the challenge that is, but at the same time, the people aren't exactly behaving themselves. I mean, which is why he's responding to them. We had it just this week with the 12 spies we were discussing a little bit earlier today, that there was a chance to really hang on to extraordinary faith of a God that said, I will bring you to a promised land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to a land that would be extraordinary for you and your children, as promised to Abraham in the covenant of the pieces, etc., etc. Genesis 17, 18, 19. It's just extraordinary. And they just had to say, we believe. And what they came back from was a military reconnaissance that said, the people are here, they're huge, their cities are fortified, they're enormous. We saw the giants, we can't do it. And as we said, the report from the 10 of the 12 spies was factually accurate. But what was lacking was this genuine sense of faith. You are a few weeks away from the revelation at Sinai. What is wrong with you? And so we see that God is just responding as a parent would to a kid who just doesn't get it. How many times can I show you that we are in this together, that neither of us are leaving each other, however upset we get? This is a relationship. It's a covenant. It doesn't break. And that's where I think the really difficult part of the history is that this covenant with us and God is not for breaking, and it's not for replacement. It is a covenant that exists and still exists. And it was the refusal, I think, of Christianity to accept that And if we get up to Nostra Aetate in 1956, where just the beginnings of an expression that there was a covenant that wasn't broken, and we have to respect and now start to re-engage on the basis that Judaism did not stop, become fossilized, and go into the Museum of Judaism in the year 71. It continued and flourished, and the Judaism that I live and breathe and appreciate now in an Orthodox sense, keeping as much as I can of all 613 commandments, whether they're able to be practiced or not. They don't leave my psyche, they don't leave my learning and our spirit. And that is really important. And that is the challenge that we have to try and express that we are a people of a covenant. The covenant has not changed. And your covenant is an additional one that you have now, or that Christianity has tried over 2,000 years to replace. And there were 4 levels that we thought we were looking at, and 4 responses.
So just as you're finding that, I'll just nuance what you just described about Nostra Aetate. So that's Second Vatican Council, 1966 or thereabouts. And for the first time, the Catholic Church says, there is an ongoing covenant between God and Jews. Now, what you've got to remember about Second Vatican Council is that before about that time, the Catholics wouldn't have recognized me as being a Christian. So recognizing you as having a connection to God, was well outside the imagination. So that's a big breakthrough. But also the Lutherans wouldn't recognize the Presbyterians. I mean, all these different divisions of Christianity didn't recognize themselves up until about that sort of time. I mean, you can nuance the liberal ends and the more conservative ends, but look at Northern Ireland. I mean, it's fundamentally a religious dispute, and there were profound differences. So I think Nostra Aetate is a date I should have mentioned. The paper encyclical 62, yeah. So that's the beginning of the Second Vatican Council, and it is a significant recognition. Anyway, that was just a nuance. It's not just anti-Judaism; it's anti-other forms of Christianity too. That's the context. So
that is very interesting. So what we look at here is when we looked at this distinctive relationship now. So we move on from again the difficult history we could talk about for a long time, but we want to try and move through this book, which is so short in itself, but tries to cover so much ground, and we'll do as much justice as we can in this short section of conversations. There are 4 different responses to the relationship between Christianity and Judaism as they move forward through history, and they really cover the gamut of expressions and experience, and therefore they represent 4 different points of view. And I guess people on our call today, of which there are very many, there's 57 screens, which is wonderful, and more people will see it, and may see yourselves in one of these 4 elements. I would safe to say, the same way as we were discussing that even within our own congregations, we have people on broad senses, or broad elements of the spectrum. So the first response here it says, to the apparent tension between Christian and Jewish beliefs about the people of God is an unqualified denial of the claims of the Jewish people since the time of Christ. In other words, Jesus comes along, and after his ascension, there is a sense that there is a new covenant, and the Jews have no claim whatsoever on a relationship with God. It has been replaced by Christianity, known as the replacement theory, and therefore we have nothing more to discuss, and the only thing we could do is fold ourselves into this new covenant, and that's the only way we go forward, because we have no existence. That's the first. The second, or let's do the fourth. The fourth, on the absolute other end of the spectrum, is an unqualified affirmation of the claims of the Jewish people after the time of Christ, that they are God's chosen people. In other words, all of this happens. Christianity starts and continues and evolves, and for the Jews, there is no difference in what has happened. It is a separate faith, a separate entity, a separate covenant, a separate experience, and therefore our relationship with God, the covenant that we have, not only is it unbroken, it is unchanged. It's fundamentally exactly as it always was. And the existence or the appearance of Christianity is a completely separate timeline whatsoever and has no bearing on us at all. But at the same time, it says for the fourth that Christianity should recognize that even though it has its own unique journey, it has to reference the Jews' unique journey as well, and somehow connect those two together as parallel or as different but equally valid relationships. That's the fourth. And then in the middle there are the second and third. And the second response, closer to the one that there is nothing for the Jews to talk about anymore, is that there is an acceptance that is qualified with some correction of the claims of the Jewish people that they're God's chosen people. So the idea is that the Jews have some claim of some element of some connection to God, but if we're looking at it in an 80-20 rule, it's only 20% left. It's very nice. It's token, but really, ultimately, again, it's closer to the point, position one, which is basically you'll fold in eventually. You're wrong. And the third response is this really interesting idea, which I really wanted to discuss with you, is called the acknowledgement of mystery regarding the claims of the Jewish people after the time of Christ that they are God's Jewish people. So it's not quite a sense that the Jews have everything to say and the Christians have nothing. It's not a sense that the Christians have everything to say and the Jews have nothing. And it's not that the Jews have a little bit to say, but ultimately they'll come over. It's the sense that the Jews really have something to say, but it is definitely a part of a broader conversation now that one can't exist without the other, and that Christianity just as much, if not more, validity. And that mystery part is really the part that I want to get to, because that, for me, is where my head is in terms of the relationship with Christianity. There is something to say for Christianity. It's a huge following with upwards of, I think, 2 billion adherents. Give or take. And we are a much smaller number. People don't quite know what it is. And we're not a proselytizing religion, so we're not out trying to convert anyone. And we're hoping that nobody will try and convert us either, because we're quite happy where we are. But where does that sit? What is this word mystery that is used? I've seen a number of times.
A couple of senses of the word mystery. Now, one sense which I think is picked up in the book, certainly I've only read the first 2 chapters so far, but I think it is picked up even in those, is that mystery comes from the Greek word mysterion, if you want to pronounce it like that, for which the Latin translation is sacramentum. So actually the word sacrament and the word mystery are very closely linked. And as you find in Aquinas's writings and often set to music, famous parts of the liturgy derive from Aquinas's writings in the 13th century, and he often refers to the sacrament of the Eucharist as being a mystery. So the reason for stressing that point is that I think there is a really interesting line of inquiry in which Christians can come to see Jews as sacraments.
So what do you mean by sacrament? It's not a word that I'm used to.
Well, a sacrament, other than technically,
wine is called
means an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual truth. So again, this is
a visible sign
of an
inward and spiritual truth.
So
we're a representation of something spiritual.
Yeah, so for the Anglicans, for Catholics, there will be 7 sacraments, including marriage and confirmation and ordination. Anglicans differ, as you would imagine, about this, because they're always not sure if they're Protestants or Catholics. But there are 2 that are uncontroversial, that they're sacraments. The first is the Eucharist, the bread and wine, the descendant of the Passover meal, and the second is baptism. So to say that Judaism as a whole, or Jews individually, I mean, we could discuss that, has a sacramental quality, means there is a unique, special and privileged way in which this, i.e. Judaism, or someone like yourself as a Jew, can communicate God to a Christian. That is unsubstitutable. In other words, you can't just bypass and use another route. That there is a unique quality to Christians' relationship with Jews, individually or collectively, and there is an encounter with God to be made in that relationship that is indispensable, and that is a gift of God to the church. So that would be one, meaning one. I'll do the other one, and then I'll hand over the microphone. So Gabriel Marcel, the French Catholic philosopher, 20th century philosopher, made a really significant distinction, which I've used a lot in my own writing, between a problem and a mystery. He says a problem is something like a problem you have with your tap. It's a bit of a plumbing problem. There's only about 5 different kinds of washer. The plumber has them all in the bag. They've been to plumbing college. They know everything there is about different kinds of taps, and they've seen it 100 times before, and they fix it. So problem is attached to words like fix and solution. Whereas mystery is something you've never seen before by definition. And you have to use all your experience, not just your training, but all your experience, distilled wisdom of your experience, to confront it. And another difference is a problem is something you can walk around the outside of. A mystery is something you have to enter. Now, you can see where I'm going with this. You know, the Jews have historically been treated as a problem. They should have been treated as a mystery. Do you see what I mean? So when you put the Marcel's notion of a mystery as a thing of wonder that requires the whole of your experience to encounter, and it's basically a route to worship, together with Aquinas's notion of a sacrament, and the idea of Jews as a sacrament is not Aquinas's idea. But when you put Marcel and Aquinas together, then I think you get a very dynamic way of the church to relate to Jews as a mystery and potentially a sacrament.
So what you're saying is that the church, there's a certain path to God which requires the Jewish totality of experience to explain.
Yes.
Which would allow Christians a better understanding of what their role is, what our role is, or what God's role is.
If Christians are fully to worship God, they must employ all the gifts God has given to them for the purpose. It's quite common to see the scripture, to see prayer, to see baptism and Eucharist as among those gifts. It's, I think, a new thing to say that Christians should regard the Jews as one of those gifts, but I would say that.
So you would say that. What I'm saying is that does that necessarily follow that the only way for that to happen is for the Jews not just to express what it is that their Judaism means, but to actually fold themselves into Christianity?
No, I don't think it means that at all. I think
as opposed to if I were to show you everything that I believe that is the correct approach to God, then theoretically, is it Christianity that should fold back into Judaism?
Well,
and Christianity?
I wouldn't want to prejudge that. I think the encounter is a sacred encounter. And I'm not saying there can't be sacred encounters with Muslims and Hindus and so on. But there is this particular encounter for a Christian with a Jew. Whether a Jew feels the same way or not is entirely up to you. But I would say for Christians, you cannot understand your own faith unless you understand and encounter Judaism, not just as a theory, but as a lived experience, as a genuine relationship. That there is, because Jesus, you can't understand Jesus unless you understand Judaism. It's kind of a no-brainer, really. If this was the life in which Jesus was taken up, then you want to understand the life that Jesus had. And okay, he was before the destruction of the Second Temple, but the whole, you can't understand your liturgy, you can't understand your scripture, you can't understand your Savior. There is, the list is long if you don't understand Judaism. And so Judaism is a gift from God to the church. What the church is to Judaism is not for me to decide. That's for Jews to decide. But for what is for me to decide is to receive the abundant gifts of God. In our Heart Edge movement, what we say over and over again is that God gives the church everything it needs. The problem is not that God doesn't give the church what it needs. The problem is the church is so reluctant to receive the abundant gifts that God gives. Well, Judaism, it seems to me, is like the biggest single one of those gifts.
Well, the sense for me in terms of Judaism is that if we take this all the way through, then the question would be, is there a possibility of an encounter that does not require a step afterwards, which is conversion? In other words, is there a sense that you would engage with what the Jews have, or how they have engaged, how we have engaged with our faith through all this time, not to say that it is now, as it were, defunct. It is an old, fossilized form of religion which doesn't have much to say. The question is that possible to have that encounter without the sense of almost like, you could almost talk about a date that gets to a certain point at the point, okay, now what do we do now? Do we just come back for another drink? Do we discuss whether we're going to move forward as in a relationship? Or is there a sense that Christianity wants more than just to hear from the Jews and then to walk back to its own separate path, which is where I say myself between position 4, which is that I have nothing that I have to apologize about or talk about or discuss in any way, because the covenant that I have is unbroken. The evolution of Judaism that has happened over 2,000 years is immensely powerful and based on certain, well, there are exegetical principles. In other words, we can't even learn certain scriptures in a certain way without the transmission and understanding of how previous generations did it. There is a very clear line of what's called masoret, or transmission from one to the other, and breaking with that, from my perspective as an Orthodox Jew, means that even denominations outside of Orthodoxy have made one step too far, and the ultimate, I believe that one step too far was Christianity itself, that put itself squarely outside of at the time was a mainstream Orthodox. Again, we could talk about mainstream Orthodox at the time, towards the end of the Second Temple. It was Pharisees and Sadducees and Essenes, and it was not mainstream in any sense. And Pharisaic Judaism is the one that became the basis for the rabbinic evolution that became rabbinic
Which is
Judaism.
no doubt why Pharisees get such a hard time in the Gospels, because they were
the Pharisees were what we would call in Judaism. They were the front. They were the ones who were really hardcore, fundamentalist for the tradition in every sense, and weren't willing to break in any sense. And the word Pharisee is from the word parushim. Lifrosh means to separate. So Pharisees, by definition, are people who separate themselves from any possibility of moving outside of a very, very distinct tradition they are going to maintain under all costs. And this is the persecution that we have suffered throughout the ages, because we refuse to move away from a belief of this position 4, that we have nothing to apologize for, nothing that needs to be changed in our fundamental function, our religion. And if there's a conversation to be had, it is a conversation of the type that you and I are having, that would be absolutely impossible before the 1940s. And then for the 1900 years before that, that would have resulted in death. So this is a very new type of conversation.
And it's a gift. And I don't think it's a conversation that can happen if it has a predetermined outcome. And I would again distinguish that between a conversation between a Christian and a Muslim, because when I was at Duke University, I used to run something called the Faith Council, which brought together people from the different faith traditions. About 10 of us. I think there was just one Jew, but there were certainly 2 kinds of Muslim. There was one kind of Hindu. There was 2 or 3 different kinds of Christian. And I always used to joke with the imam that I was trying to convert him, and he would joke that he was trying to convert me. And it was he became a very good friend. We had a lot of respect for each other. I didn't make that joke with the rabbi. That wasn't funny.
No.
But
it's not, as it turns out.
But I did with the Muslim.
Right.
But it wasn't just because it wasn't funny. It was because I don't know if that's what I was actually trying to do. I don't think this conversation can have a predetermined outcome in that kind of a way. The imams in my conversation did have a predetermined outcome, but we recognized that we were both playing the same game, and that was going to be deferred at least by many years, if it ever happened at all, in either direction. Whereas the conversation that I was having with the rabbi, as I've said, I don't know if that was a conversation he was having with me, but conversation I was having with the rabbi, I guess the best analogy would be if you go and see your grandparents and somebody goes in the loft and gets down all the photographs of your family history, and you with eyes open, you think, my great uncle looks just like me, and nobody else in the family has looked like. I had no idea. That's what the conversation's like, where you're teaching me what Pharisee means, what Zechariah 7 and 8 mean. You're teaching me the things that I thought were mine, but I'd never seen those photographs. It's the same family. I am your child in that sense, and you are showing me what the family is. So one thing that happened to me quite some time ago when I was a young man was that I went to Haifa in 1986, and I went to a house because I was told my parents had lived there in the 50s. And when I got there, it was the right house, but I had a funny feeling about it. And then I looked all around, And I realized I'd been there 2 years before. I'd been there because I'd been to Haifa before. I was working on a kibbutz at the time. And it was a youth hostel. And I played volleyball there with people of all nationalities, as you do when you're 18 years old and you go to a youth hostel. But gradually, as I look back, I realized that was a kind of an experience of what it's like for a Christian to encounter a Jew. This was a house that my grandparents had lived in. They'd been living in there quite some time ago. I had been to that house in 1984. I had not known that my grandparents had lived in that house. Only when I came back, was more educated, had spoken to other members of my family and got the address of where my grandparents had lived. And I found I'd been to that house before, but my grandparents had been living it, arguably, 4 centuries. So Christians are constantly coming to a house that the Jews built, that the Jews lived in for centuries. The Christians showed up. They never asked themselves who lived in this house before, whose house it was. Now, it's quite understandable that their habits living in that house are different from the habits of their parents or grandparents who lived in that house. It's quite appropriate. It's not necessarily rights and wrongs way to live. What Christians have to admit is this wasn't originally our house. This was your house. And actually, but in that sense, we're not different. We are your descendants. Do you see what I mean? If you begin the conversation with that kind of humility, then you're in a real conversation. But if you're in a conversation that says, it all changed 2,000 years ago and we became the goodies and you became the baddies, so if you want to be a goodie, you've got to come and be like us, then you can't have a conversation like that.
What's interesting, if we take that analogy, and it's almost an interesting place to stop for now before we look into some of the questions, I'm sure Jonathan will put himself on screen and tell us some of the comments that have happened. But what really is important to state from my perspective is I've never left that house.
No,
we're still there.
It's still living.
We're still living there. You can come and visit.
Thank you very much.
Get away to
Exactly.
lots of different places, right. But not only have we never left the house, and this is not a political statement, this is a theological and a religious statement. We have no problem continuing to live there, and we're always happy to have guests in our house. But ultimately, they're guests, and this is our home. And the home is the theological relationship and the covenant we have with God, which we've never left. And even after 70, there are many people, and taking your analogy even further, there are people who have been kicked out of their house because they haven't behaved appropriately. It doesn't mean that the parent who did the kicking out doesn't love them any less, or sometimes it's even more, but sometimes it's going to be a long journey. And maybe that journey for us is a journey that we need to figure out how to come back to the house that has never been left for us. This idea that God will never forsake us, and we believe that inherently in all of our things. Our prayers on a Monday and Thursday say we have been left a small number from a large people. We have never forgotten you, God. Please don't forget us. And that our Tachanun prayer, Na'al tishkachenu, we say, do not ever forsake us and forget us, because we are still here. And that moment, I think, and what you're saying is to dial all that back together, is that this is a conversation that is open. In other words, it is not for you to convince me of anything or me to convince you. It's me to share my experience with you, for you to have a better understanding of where you are, and for you to share experience with me, for me to have a better understanding of a faith that I haven't lost and a faith that I believe is strong. And actually my conversations with you and sharing ideas with you actually give me more reassurance that I am where I'm supposed to be. And I'm hoping that as an interesting way, it would give you a sense that you are where you are supposed to be, but what you're doing with where you're supposed to be is the conversation that will stay open.
Well, you could describe Christianity as ultra-reform Judaism, which from an Orthodox point of view, you for a long time regarded as, I was going to say beyond the pale, well, that's probably a terrible expression in this conversation, but just outside the legitimate range of diversity. Well, that's the interesting conversation that I think we've got to have. But yeah, no, it's your house, and we Christians are guests in a Jewish home. That's what Christians need to understand. In a sense, my argument isn't actually so much with you; it's more with other Christians.
So we'll leave it there for a minute. Jonathan, firstly, thank you very, very much for this opportunity. It really has been. It's been wonderful to get started. There's so much more to say. I'm going to have to reread some elements on the basis of what you said. I'm going to have to re-understand this. There's a paragraph in Numbers that you said something actually, which is going to now make me go away and have another think. Not that it changes my view, but it gives me a different perspective. And I love that about our conversations. because it gives me a deeper perspective on what I've looked at.
We need to.
But let's go to Jonathan and see what he has to say. So thank you very much, Sam.
Thank you.
Okay, so we've got a great opening question from Patrick. Doesn't God's unfailing word tend to see Judaism as Christianity's sibling rather than parent, given its development over time in general and the formative nature of the centuries from the fall of the temple to the completion of the Talmuds?
The document itself, I think that's fair.
Yeah.
That's where I disagree with it. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's what we said. You're not comfortable with that definition.
No, I think that's a kind of, that's a nice way to begin. We're brothers, this kind of thing. I just think historically we are the child of Judaism. I mean, that's where I'd make a difference from, I differ in my view from the document. But the point is fair. It's fair about the document. I think that is what the document says.
I think there's a nature of being comfortable with the differences that we have as the basis and the beginning of a conversation. If we're trying to look for similarities on a very basic theological level, then we're not going to have a fruitful and helpful conversation because there's nowhere to talk.
Well, I mean, you've referred to a profound conversation within Judaism. There is also a profound conversation within Christianity. And to give an example of that, and this is a huge subject that would take us more than the next two sessions combined, but the Christian doctrine of the atonement is absolutely central to many Christians' understanding of who Christ is and was. The one that made the sacrifice that finally took away sins and brought eternal life, to give the simplest explanation. Now, many versions of the atonement theory, which the church as a whole has never pinned down one understanding, more or less ignore the Old Testament, as I would call it. Now, what a point that hasn't sufficiently often been made, in my view, is that I wonder if there is an anti-Semitic character to some of those, an undertone, that we can actually tell the story of God without needing to tell the story of the Jews. And I think in that sense, those atonement theories are problematic. I often find them problematic for other reasons, but I think they're problematic to the extent that they airbrush the Jews out of the story. Why would you want to do that? Unless you had a supersessionist view.
The story doesn't begin at 33.
Exactly.
Exactly. The story begins
the
story begins for us, at creation. The story begins.
I would
Abraham.
say even before creation, but that's for a conversation. We need to go back to Jonathan.
Okay, thank you,
Jonathan.
Okay,
so we're going to go on to a question from Emily. Is the biggest difference between Judaism and Christianity who the Messiah is? How can you authentically say Christ is Messiah for all peoples, yet respect eternal covenant with the Jews?
Well, that's the question we're trying to answer.
We're going to get to it some point.
You've got to stay tuned, and we'll answer it a minute before the end of the last session. But no, that is the question. If we had an answer we both agreed to that one, we wouldn't be here.
Yeah, I think that, the sense is, in the simplest terms, that as Sam described, this idea that Jesus, he came, he was as described in Christianity, the Word made flesh, and becomes someone who takes on the sins of the world, and therefore there's absolution, and therefore all you need to do is accept him, and you can move forward to the next stage. We believe in Judaism that the Messiah has not yet come. We are on this ongoing journey, and therefore we have no problem in a sense that he has not been here, although there have been people over the course of time with false messiahs within Judaism who really wanted to feel that they have to have something to hold on to. It was almost a sense of a lack of faith rather than a reimagining of a depth of faith, that we are comfortable knowing that our Messiah is a constant idea of something in the future. The future may be in 5 minutes' time, in an hour's time, at the end of all time, but we actually are still on a journey which we feel that Christianity short-circuited to a sense and said, now we have completed that part of the mission, and now we're going to move on to the next stage. We're not there yet.
Yeah, I think I would have a critique of that, which isn't just a critique of conventional Judaism, but is actually a critique of much of Christianity. And people who are familiar with my work, of whom I recognize a few on the call tonight, will be used to me saying this, so I'll try and keep it to 30 seconds. My conviction is that God's eternal purpose is to be with us. And that, for me as a Christian, is expressed most fully in Christ. And in fact, the reason for the creation of the world was for God to be with us. Now, Jews have a different word, a complementary word, I would say, for what it means for God to be with us, and that word is covenant. And so, in a sense, covenant plays the same role for Jews that Christ plays in my understanding of theology. And of course, the fact that Jesus is often described as new covenant is often interpreted by Christians as somehow a replacement for the old covenant didn't work, or was abrogated by the Jews, or however you narrate the story. To me, the point is that the covenant is one of the most, perhaps the most profound metaphor for what God being with us and us being with one another, us being with, today we would say, with the creation, entails all of that. Now, to me, the point is, it's about God being with us. So in that sense, if I was going to build a constructive joint Christian and Jewish theology, it would come out of that notion that we're both about being with God now and forever. So if you put it like that, there possibly isn't quite such a massive chasm. If you say that God being with us in Christ is the definitive form of God being with us, then you're back to the same question again. But I don't think, you see, I don't have what I call a deficit theology that says Christ only came because things had gotten a pretty pass with the Jewish covenant and somebody needed to come and rescue it. For me, Christ was always coming, because that's the abundance of God's desire to be in relationship with us. It doesn't come out of our deficit, it comes out of God's abundance. So that's a conversation for another day, maybe 2 weeks' time.
Definitely. Okay, I think, Jonathan, we are at our time. We tried to keep it at an hour. We said we would. This is a conversation that can be has been going on. Well, it's been going on for a long time. In some cases, it wasn't much of a conversation, but since 1940s, it is in some ways a new conversation. That hasn't, as you pointed out, before the 1940s, it probably wasn't happening anywhere really. So it's an exciting conversation. So I'm delighted and really honoured that we've had this chance. Thank you very much to everyone who's been here. We really are very grateful for you taking your time and listening to us both. And as Jonathan has just put on the chat, the next time we are here is the same time, 2 weeks' time, the 20th of June, on the same Zoom channel, the same booking that you would have put through Eventbrite, and that will be here at 7 o'clock. This time I'll be in Sam's flat. Yeah. And so I'll be talking to him. I'll be in just around the corner from St. Martin in the Fields. It's been wonderful to host Sam here just above the synagogue in our flat here in Western Marble Arch. And thank you very much for being with us. It's been really fantastic. And thank you to everyone who's been with us as well. Thank you again for everyone else in our community. We continue with synagogue Shacharit tomorrow morning at 7:30 in the morning for you, whatever time it would be in the morning for morning service. And 8:30. 8:30. Oh, anyway, we won't finish that sentence, but we've got to get up early here in Marble Arch. I'll have to check with Father Lincoln Harvey, just at the Annunciation around the corner, see what time he's starting. But to everybody else, have a wonderful evening. Thank you for being with us, and we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks' time. We have recorded this, and we'll figure out a way to put it out, maybe slightly edited, and we can continue with this conversation. And we look forward to seeing you on the 20th of June. All the best.